Hello and welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. We continue with our in-depth study of First Thessalonians, with today's session moving into chapter 2, the first half of chapter 2. And we'll read verses 1 through 12 in the New Revised Standard Version. You yourselves know, brothers and sisters, that our coming to you was not in vain. But though we had already suffered and been shamefully mistreated at Philippi, as you know, we had courage in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in spite of great opposition. For our appeal does not spring from deceit or impure motives or trickery, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the message of the gospel, even so we speak not to please mortals, but to please God, who tests our hearts. As you know, and as God is our witness, we never came with words of flattery or with a pretext for greed, nor did we seek praise from mortals, whether from you or from others, though we might have made demands as apostles of Christ. But we were gentle among you, like a nurse tenderly caring for her children. So deeply do we care for you that we are determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you have become very dear to us. You remember our labor and toil, brothers and sisters, who work night and day, so that we might not burden any of you while we proclaim to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how pure, upright, and blameless our conduct was toward you believers. As you know, we dealt with each one of you like a father with his children, urging and encouraging you and pleading that you lead a life worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. Paul here in the introduction, or in the first part of this chapter, now has turned from his introduction and greeting to the body of his letter after that long Thanksgiving, as we discussed last time. It seems his first issue is to address the team's sudden departure from Philippi and short stay in Thessalonians in a way. Even though he doesn't specifically point out some of that, he makes reference to it, and we studied it in Acts as part of our setting the stage for this book. Scholars suggest Paul seems to assume there are misconceptions surrounding what happened. He focuses his comments around a theme that our visit was not a failure or not in vain. We are not deceitful towards you, in other words. These are some of the ideas that you see as subtitles even in some Bibles. Several scholars remark that Paul is writing here in an apologetic manner, at least initially. Thus they suspect he is aware and believes that some negative criticism exists towards him and his team. What type of criticism, some ask? Something related to the team's character as missionaries, maybe ulterior motives, or less than genuine missionary roles. Thus Paul writes with arguments to reverse and clear up such ideas if they exist. Just a reminder from Acts 17 that the Jewish community and the larger pagan audience in Thessalonica and Philippi were quite hostile against Paul and his team. He will address that more directly later in chapter 2, and when he does, he indicates that in Thessalonica at least, it was the Gentiles who were the main perpetrators against the Christians, while Acts tends to point a little more towards the Jews. So here in verse 1, Paul is apparently referring to his and Silas's beating. They were beat with rods, and imprisonment as missionaries in Philippi. Their ill treatment was a direct result of their teaching, causing civil disruption among the people. They were freed when the earthquake occurred, and the jailer let them go, with them hurriedly along to Thessalonica. So some scholars suggest maybe Paul assumes some think this idea that we were being run out of Philippi and you've been run out of our town too. The Greek words translated as failure or in vain here in verse 1 is probably better translated empty, scholars say. For example, Dr. Gene Green goes further and translates all of it this way: our entry was not without sound motives and not without the power of God behind us. He suggests that this is the message Paul is really trying to send, he believes here, as he reads this in the Greek. Scholars suggest the focus here is clearly on their entry, specifically, and not necessarily the whole or total mission. Likely they had visible wounds from having been beaten with rods in Philippi, and thus most likely were received initially with much suspicion, more as a criminal might be, rather than an agent of good religion or a religion of promise. After all, beating wounds were not to be found on Roman citizens of good standing. And Paul in his other writings definitely points out he's a Roman citizen and expects to be treated as one. So some scholars suggest Paul is saying here, despite some first impressions that may be there because of how we looked, the team was emboldened by God to preach God's gospel about Christ. Thus God granted us the willpower to, as one scholar says, suck it up and go about the missionary job that God had given us to do. Paul credits God as the source of their boldness, courage, and personal achievements. All of it was derived from God, as we have trust and courage in our God. He doesn't want any of this given to him for any personal benefits that he or human benefits here. His concept is to be thankful to God and to make sure they understand that God is empowering them to do the work. Dr. Javente says Paul means they were empowered by God's Holy Spirit as teachers during this period of persecution to do what they did. Thus, even though it might have been reasonable in human mindset of what they saw on arrival for us to lay low and remain silent, to stay out of trouble, that is not our way or duty under God's charge, even though it would be a meaningful human approach. Thus we obeyed God's will and acted through the courage provided by God for your benefit. You need to see it that way, is Paul's point. Dr. Gene Green, in his commentary, makes a point here that may help us understand this. He says Greek Cynic philosophers were common missionaries in the same area at the time of Paul. Those missionaries, Cynic missionaries, often appeared before an audience, haggard in appearance, to attract sympathy, only to react very boldly in their presentations as they taught a different set of moral values than the Greco-Macedonian people had. Therefore, Green offers this suggestion. He says maybe the team was being confused with Scythics, especially with this bold approach and the wounds on their body. Why would in other words, it would be logical for a person to assume, why would any God want to send agents that looked like Paul and Silas to do his work? Therefore, Paul reveals that and deals out that he had pure motives, that his team had pure motives. And this would be a critical defense to remove the confusion. So Paul is trying to make it very clear that both their motives and their methods were pure and from God in origin and source, and not in any way were they some sort of man-made scheme of corrupt hustlers that were coming to them. The cynics also made the point that they were not driven by greed, and their motives were pure and willing. In other words, the very same ones that Paul's using in his defense. But they accepted the scorn of society as a price for presenting their values, because they were earnest also. They had a different set of values. So if this is the group Paul has been confused with, the people will need to separate them based on the details, as there is a lot of overlap of style, but a very different message. In verse 4, Paul says, we speak as men approved by God to be entrusted with this gospel. Approval here essentially means we are apostles, although he hasn't used that word up to this point. Tested by God himself for his ministry, several scholars suggest. Thus we are not trying to please men, but God who tests us in our hearts. Dr. Charles Wanamaker suggests this is quite an assertion made by Paul here, and he provides no specific evidence here to back that up. Thus, his reader, then as we are today, are left to accept this on faith without evidence, other than what the Thessalonians observed themselves, which we don't have that record. Several scholars remark it is just this type of statement that greatly complicates modern readers and students of the Bible and accepting this. In our generation, in our modern generation, we are accustomed to having lots of data available when arguments are presented. That's not the way Paul writes. It's not there. And so that's part of, as we study the Bible, as we study Paul's writings, it's part of what we have to deal with. And it's part of what we have to be aware of. Dr. Beverly Robert Giovanni addresses verse 7 here too. Here Paul says, we might have made demands of you as apostles of Christ. There he used the word apostles. What does he mean here, she says? She suggests he is using this as a Greek idiom. A reference, if you will, she says, that they likely understood what it meant more easily than we do. Probably that it could have been interpreted that he would be authoritative. He could have been authoritative and heavily handed with them as an apostle, using our rank to obtain financial support, she said some would suggest. But makes it clear he did not, or they did not. At least that's the way most people interpret it. She believes the support for that position comes with his response following this apostle, that they were not greedy. That she suspects it is financial, that he's primarily referring to here. But others argue that the Greek here is better rendered as burden, which is how the NIV uses it, by the way. Burden is, in other Greek literature of the time, referred specifically usually to economic issues, such as tax burden. They would use the word when they're referring to financial burden. Several then argue that Paul here is just following his usual practice, which we learn in other letters, was that he did not seek financial support from those he was trying to convert, or the particular audience he was involved with preaching the gospel to at that time. But the literature of the time uses this same word, Greek word, also to imply authority at times. Thus, in verse 9, the context could actually be both. And several scholars argue they believe it is both, that he's using this awkwardly with intent, that he could have been authoritative in demanding more of them, but he also could have been authoritative in demanding financial support for the ministry. He makes a point, though, that they labored to support themselves, which most scholars suggest, based on readings in other letters, that Paul is mainly using this from a financial standpoint. That his normal practice was to not charge or not ask for donations in that community at the time that they were doing missionary work there, but instead to be supported on his own, as well as by support that may be coming in from the other churches that was previously formed. We see that in some of his other letters. And that this particular point here in 1 Thessalonians is used by many missionary groups to support why they suggest that they be supported, that is, modern day missionaries, they be supported by the General Church Council or by established churches, and not be a burden onto the foreign field that they are trying to do minister or work in. Note in verse 7 also that this word apostle is plural. What does that mean? Most scholars suggest Paul is referring not just to himself, but to at least he and Silas, for sure, and maybe even for Timothy. There is good evidence that there were more than 12 apostles. There was Paul plus 12. And that Silas probably was an apostle, maybe even outranked in the overall church, Paul, because he was kind of sent there as the witness initially. Timothy is mentioned in several other letters of Paul, but he's never addressed as apostle, so most people suspect he's referring to Paul and Silas. Several scholars remark concerning the tenderness of the ministry suggested here in verse 7 and 8. A key point of debate is that the word translated gentle is sometimes translated as infant. Why? Because there is a text critical issue here. The Greek word that's here, that's translated infant, is spelled Nepioi. It's found here and in most of the oldest Greek manuscripts of this book. But the Greek word Epioi, meaning gentle, is found in some. So the loss of the N is often considered to be a scriptural copy error here. Earliest copies seem to favor infant, meaning it would originally been Nepiol. But several scholars argue that gentle is better here, and that the copy difference was likely intentional for that very reason. That is, the scribe wrote it, it didn't make sense as an infant. Gentle makes more sense, many argue. Others, though, argue it is equally appropriate if infant is being used as a metaphoric term. Metaphorically, meaning gentleness, requiring patience and care, which many would argue that's what Paul is trying to do here, is to remind them that they had great patience, very careful patience in dealing with these people in Thessalonica. That's kind of how the four scholars that I mainly use here, that's how they, the points they make, and hopefully those points will help you better understand what's there in those first 12 verses of chapter 2. Hopefully we'll see you next week.